Black Trust Notes, October 21st, 2025. What we know, where does that leave us, and the role of Black trust. The No Kings marches, 7 million strong last weekend, indicate that Americans have gotten the memo. What do we know? The American mainstream now recognizes that in the last 10 months, the corporate-controlled political system has become a corporate authoritarian state. Where does this leave African Americans? How does trust factor in? We, like millions of Americans, want so badly to believe in the myth of the country's democratic exceptionalism, the notion that the United States nobly stands for truth, justice, and the American way. We, like the 7 million protesters in the streets last Saturday, have a deep intergenerational investment in the folkloric American dream that we also cling to the narrative. The No Kings marches were actually consummate examples of what founding oligarch James Madison called cooling mechanisms. America's brilliant founders knew that if the United States was going to be a sustainable experiment, they needed to bake into the Constitution the right of those who they perceived to be the rabble to dissent and peaceably assemble, to feel the exhilaration of seeking redress of their government. Madison in particular was obsessed with the need to distance the general population, read poor people with no property, which he called factions, from holding sway over governing policy. The founders couldn't abide factions united in some common impulse or passion that could be adverse to the aggregate interest of the community. Read, don't oppose oligarchic power, wealth, and control. Protests, mass demonstrations that express dissent, generate an exhilarating sense of shared purpose. But more importantly, protests are an essential pressure release valve for the people's, i.e., the factions' venting of pent-up frustration, which intensifies every time they catch a glimpse of their given role as fodder for oligarchic greed. Breathing space for dissent. Pressure release points for John Q. Public are interwoven throughout the system and can be absorbed by the framework without inordinately disrupting the plutocrat status quo. Similarly, electoral politics are a smoke and mirror mirage in which we especially fought so hard to participate. However, it's yet another cooling mechanism which keeps us distracted and wrapped up in electing representatives who we mistakenly believe will in aggregate do something other than the bidding of the corporations which fund their congressional seats. Do we really trust the electoral system, or are we just in so deep without obvious alternatives that we dare not think about it too much? The gutting of the Voting Rights Act, grotesque gerrymandering, and every imaginable type of voter suppression occurring now with inexorable ease is indicative of just what a performative veneer American democracy is. The very blueprint of the system was designed to reflexively thwart or prevent any change that opposes the transgenerational oligarchic grip. It has been astonishing to realize how much of American democracy's scaffolding was only propped up by norms and fragile shared perception. We never anticipated an outright autocrat who would sadistically bulldoze everything. Nevertheless, we go through the civic motions since we have no other recourse, and that we must, because this is our exquisite yet excruciating classroom, as painful as it may seem. So where does this leave African Americans? How does trust factor in? We know that the stripping of rights under the current authoritarian regime affects all Americans and the bulk of Saturday's No Kings protesters. might have a shot at clawing back some semblance of democracy that was working for them to a certain extent. If a pluralistic upsurge becomes a sustained, mass, nonviolent civil obedience movement that defies all odds and overthrows the oligarchic corporate state, good on the protesters. Amen to that. If we dare to dream, the country may have another 40 to 50-year cycle of pluralistic expansion before the pendulum swings back. But let's get real. A rising tide lifts all boats goes just so far in this country. Given Black ancestral history, we know in our gut, more acutely than most, that the American experiment has been a business venture from the start and at its very core has absolutely nothing to do with our collective well-being. So even in the best case scenario, it behooves Blacks not to be lulled this time and to opt to play a deeper, long game. W.E.B. Du Bois said in his overanalyzed exploration of Black American two-ness or double consciousness, as a people, we struggle to reconcile our Black and American identities in a dominant white culture. Du Bois said that 122 years ago, in the midst of the post-Reconstruction reign of violent racial terror, disenfranchisement, and squashing of rights. Where do we stand internally and externally with that today? In 2025, ICE agents are landing on the roofs of Chicago apartment buildings, propelling down walls, extracting and separating residents into brown and Black lines. The cyclical historical pendulum has swung so deeply into authoritarian territory that 2025 feels eerily like 1870s déjà vu. Government overreach and state-sanctioned violent intimidation is once again our daily reality. Given the militarization of cities and the administration's outright declaration of war on inner cities, are we as a people still as trapped in the delusion of American exceptionalism or limited by double consciousness? Our sense of agency and capacity to let white supremacist gaslighting roll off of us has waxed strong since Du Bois said his piece in 1903. We can metacognitively see ourselves. We can develop strategies at much deeper levels than organizing marches. We can appreciate this country for both its atypically righteous aspirations, while still being acutely aware enough of its chasmic deficits to get out of the way of the pendulum as it invariably swings back and forth. So where does this leave African Americans? How does trust factor in? Might the souls of us Black folk consider taking a different approach this cycle? Consider for a moment that if Black folks decided to try something different this time around, it may require us to do some internal work as we simultaneously deal with the snap cuts, ice, and our erasure from our children's history books. We are some of the most grounded and resilient people on the planet, inherently and because we've had to be. We can trust ourselves to take a giant step back from the frenetic scene on the ground for a moment. Adopt an expanded vantage point that allows us to clearly see the whole playing field. Rest assured that a bird's eye, dispassionate, compassionate perspective doesn't make us any less committed to what's happening in the trenches. We can trust ourselves to courageously let go of the spectrum of American identity myth narratives, which is fundamentally a conflicted cognitive distortion. These are admittedly enmeshed with our identity as Black Americans and need to be objectified, seen for what they are. This will take work. We can consciously, deliberately, consistently work to build trust in each other, which, given our history, is in and of itself a revolutionary act.